Hello, kia ora, and welcome to CookieCast, the podcast that's all about the Cook Islands. This is the place to meet people who have their own insight into this Polynesian paradise in the South Pacific. I'm John Roberts, and this edition is a very personal insight into the everyday life of a young family who moved from their home in England to the Cook Islands to work as missionaries more than 60 years ago. These days, social media is the top choice for people who want to share their daily life with family and friends far away. But back in the late 1950s and early 60s, there was no such thing as the internet, and letter writing was the main way to communicate. So it is that a unique collection of letters, photographs and documents from that era are shedding light on the lives of John Sturney and his wife Rita, who were just 27 and 28 when they set off for the other side of the world with their 10-month-old son Marcus. What they wrote home to their parents is the basis and inspiration for a fascinating new book called Legacy, A Missionary's Life, Letters from the Cook Islands. It's thanks to my guest, their son, Simeon Sturney, and his family, that we can now read a remarkable story. Kia ora, Simeon.
Kia ora, John.
Now, we tend to think of missionaries as something from the 19th century. And even back in the 1960s, the Cook Islands was firmly a Christian country. So why did it need missionaries? What mission were your mum and dad on?
So, in fact, they were originally called to work with the youth to develop, and so there's quite a lot of the letters talk about Sunday school, talk about the boys' brigade, the girls' brigade. There's a lot of talk about youth because that was their focus. They were there to support these groups to develop structures and ways of doing things that perhaps were more in line with the cultures that he had come back from, or what you might have experienced in New Zealand or Australia at the time. So they were right at the edge of handing over the responsibility of the Cook Island Christian Church to the Cook Islanders. And they were at that pivotal point of pulling out. They were a few years away from when the CICC was left to run itself without the London Missionary Society's input. So their focus was on setting up structures for the locals to run, because they handed over Te Kamara, the theological college. Everything was handed over. And so even in some of the letters that we read from Bernard Thorogood, he's talking about stepping away from holding various positions in the islands, because the whole move was to encourage the islanders to step forward and run the church and the organizations.
And Bernard was the senior missionary.
He certainly was. And, of course, Bernard is still remembered by a lot of the islanders of that generation.
By writing about their time in the islands, your family were following in the footsteps of some great 19th century missionaries like the Reverends John Williams and William Wyatt Gill, both of whom wrote about their work and their travels. Do you feel a sense of continuing a tradition by publishing this book?
Yes. However, when I think about what my parents were writing and what these other esteemed people wrote, Mum and Dad were really writing to the family and to the local church. And so they weren't writing for keeping a record. They weren't putting this down so that, the church 60 years later could hear about these things. They had no idea that these letters were even going to be kept, so let alone put into volumes and then made into a book. So the focus for their letters was every day. But that's the uniqueness. It is the everyday story that we hear. And, this is a young couple writing to their parents and the church.
It's a remarkable story, but it's one very personal to your family. So why have you decided to publish these letters?
We feel that there's information in there that may not have been formally written for future generations to read, but are actually really useful. There are names, there are incidents. It's really nice to have that record. I think it would be really good for the Cook Island Christian Church. But at a personal level, it's a legacy, as the title says. It's a legacy for our family. We are so proud to have this connection with the islands, and we want the next generation, my children and my grandchildren, to know their connection and to know what their great grandparents did all those years ago.
It was a very different Cook Islands from today. What sort of place was it, according to your mum and dad? How did they describe it?
They were looking at it in relation to where they had grown up, which was West London in the UK, and therefore it was a world apart. They described in quite some detail how things were different in terms of accommodation, in terms of thinking, the way people thought about life, the equipment, facilities, everything. They just described how very, very different it was. And I'm not sure they were quite prepared for it.
They recall living in what they describe as a lovely bungalow on the capital island of Rarotonga. Lovely, that is, apart from the animal life that they shared it with.
Yeah, yes. Crabs seem to feature quite a lot, and of course they would have had the geckos back in the day, but there would have been, I think, the odd rat that made an appearance,
Which I think they adopted and named.
They did. Uh, yes, they started to embrace. It was really interesting when you read the letters. They start off almost in fear of these things, and by sort of the end or halfway through, they're adopting them. They're naming them. They're just almost ignoring them. They're just part of daily life.
Your father's work involved travelling to the outer islands, the islands beyond Rarotonga. So where did he get to, and what do we learn from him about those islands?
So he was the junior missionary, and therefore he was living and posted in Aitutaki, and his remit was to go and support all of the outer islands, particularly the northern group, and he would go on the John Williams. And there would be often a report that there was some sort of disagreement going on. There may be a little issue within the local church that he needs to go and have a conversation with them. I think what he says, and even says today, is that he was there to give a steer. He was there to show how churches could be run. He wasn't there necessarily to tell people what to do, but really give a format as to how to run a church. And so therefore his focus was very much on that when he went to the outer islands. And I think one of the things he left, and he's a diplomat even today, and so he brought people together. And I think one of the lovely things is that you can read that there was some healing that went on, that that on occasions people did make up, and things just carried on. So I think his influence and his legacy would have been the way in which he drew people together.
So which islands did he get to?
When he got to all of the northern group, back in the day, Penryn, Tongariro was called Penryn, and he really enjoyed going there. I asked him recently, what was his sort of favourite. I'm not sure you're supposed to say that, but he really did enjoy going to, as he would call it, Penryn. But Rukahana and Manahiki, of course, he got to, and he got to Puka Puka. Don't think he got to Nassau, but he got to those. Palmerston, he stopped, but again, I don't think he stayed long. He was invited in. They had a service, and then the boat moved on, but he went to all the southern islands, but his main focus was the northern ones.
I suppose he had a bit of a culture shock when he saw some of these very remote places.
Yes, although I would imagine that he got a flavour that things would be different, having experienced Aitutaki. And even though Aitutaki at the time was far more developed than the northern group, I think I mean, they were still, when they were there, they were still building kikau. I mean, they were still building houses with thatch and, that was how it was. And schoolrooms were like that. So what he would have experienced up north, he wouldn't have been too surprised at. He acclimatized himself to going at a very different pace. And I think that's something that the Northern group were quite distinct about, that they were very slower, gentler, and, they didn't have all the infrastructure that you have today. They didn't have the communication. That's perhaps the biggest change, is the level of communication. And of course, power would go down well, it wouldn't be power in some of the islands. There's very limited. I mean, you had generators and that was it. So, but he talks about, even in Aitutaki, having a hurricane lamp and, having to light that of an evening. So he would have been prepared to a degree, but and he's quite phlegmatic. He's quite able to go with the flow. And I think, that was a skill and a quality of his that I think he needed as a missionary, traveling around the northern group.
You were born on Aitutaki, Simeon, and very nearly died there just a few hours later with breathing difficulties. But thanks to a nurse called Janet Withers and a local doctor, you're here to tell the tale today. I have to say I was particularly moved reading a letter in the book from your mum, where she talks about how she put her faith in God in the difficult days after your birth. Can you read that extract for us?
At one time, we were almost without any hope left. But Simeon, with his ox-like constitution, just hung on and absolutely refused to give up. And he made us hang on too. And now we can't stop thanking God for what seems like a miraculous recovery. Everything worked together for good from the very start of the trouble. When Janet rushed Simeon down to the hospital from our house on the Monday night, she didn't know the direction at all. She went charging down our 60 steps, which are anything but sure and firm, with the baby in one arm and a hurricane lamp in the other. She knew vaguely where the doctor lived, and suddenly, without warning, found herself standing outside the door. She still doesn't know how she got there, and is quite sure that she was led by God. Some days, during the crisis, I was very depressed, and yet on others, I felt as if a huge, great burden had been lifted. But that was only after I had completely surrendered everything to God. I knew I couldn't batter against his will, and that I couldn't bargain with him, nor make promises to him. I knew I couldn't make God heal him, though at times I prayed very hard. I knew also that this sickness was in no sense a punishment to us, nor was it avoidable in any way, and therefore the only thing I could do was to surrender completely and just wait patiently.
What's described in the book as a dramatic and unfiltered account by your dad of those first days of your life are also included in the book. How did you feel reading that for the first time?
Well, I was a teenager probably when I read it in detail. I'd heard that I'd had difficulties at birth, and I was aware of that, but I didn't know the details, so I was quite shocked when I read it. But I was also amazed at the detail, and so from then on, I was really proud to have a written, detailed account of my birth, however traumatic it was. But it was a good but shocking read at first.
Quite an emotional read, I would have thought.
Absolutely. But I still get emotional when I read it even today, all these years after I first read it. And to read my parents' hearts, to sort of hear their resignation at one point is very emotional.
Now, they say it's a small world, and in some personal reflections in the book, you tell how you met up by chance in 2024 with a relative of that doctor who saved your life. Can you tell us that story?
That was crazy. So we were standing in a rugby match in a stand watching the Cook Islands play Wales in a rugby league World Cup match. There was nothing on the line except third and fourth place, and the Cook Islands were winning, and it was very exciting. And so you look around, as we stood there, we looked around at the other islanders who were cheering, and at half time we got talking to them, and there was like a couple to my right, and we found out that their son was playing, and they were from New Zealand, and they asked me why I was supporting the Cook Islands. We had, the scarf and the hat and whatever else, and the flag, waving the flag, and so we said, I was born on Aitutaki. Oh, he said, I had an uncle who lived and worked over there. He was a doctor. Well, knowing it was a small island, I asked him when it was, and then I said, what was his name? And he said, Snowball. Well, Dr. Snowball features heavily in my story, and I couldn't believe it. And I sent to my daughter, to Catherine, and said, Snowball was his uncle. And it was like, wow. So we just explained that he helped save my life. And that just brought tears to his eyes that, his uncle had been so important in someone's life, standing right next to him, the other side of the world, all these years later. It was incredible.
Now, I know, Simeon, you've been back to Aitutaki many times. Did those letters give you a greater affinity or maybe perhaps a different perspective on the place where you were born?
Absolutely. They helped to ground me and keep me connected. And I've read those letters over and over the years. And, going back and seeing where I was christened. We have letters that describe that. Going back and finding the old hospital that's described there. Going down those 60 steps. I've traced that from the letters. So having those letters, having that level of detail, enabled me. I could stand on what was the back veranda of the house I was born in, and just walk down those steps and trace that route was amazing. So those letters have really kept me close to the islands.
You followed in the family footsteps, in a sense. You're a chaplain. Do you think you could have done what your parents did back in those days? Would you have made a good missionary in the 1950s and 60s?
I love adventure. I do like going abroad. I don't think I could have done what they did. And I'm not sure. I mean, they had a 10-month-old baby, and they went out all that way. And they went out by boat, and the communication, the lack of. I'm not sure I could have done that. But I understand their heart. And I think I've inherited that from my father. And I do enjoy going abroad, and I do enjoy working with churches abroad. But they had to be special back then.
So what was it that was special about them? What motivated them to make this incredible journey halfway around the world to become missionaries?
Well, I asked my dad that very recently, and he said, well, it was just, I felt the call, and we just got on with it. And it was as simple as that. And I'm thinking, hold on a moment, it's not simple at all. But back in the day, if you felt God called you to something and you put your hand up and you said, yes, I'll do it, then you did it. And so their attitude was, we feel God's called us to do this. We'll go and do it. And it may sound very simple to us today. We are very aware of risk assessments. We live in a culture and an age where we all do risk assessments. I don't think they carried out a risk assessment at all. They felt that God had called them. They felt that God would look after them. And so they went off. And Dad would have been very aware of the former missionaries and missionaries from around the world who never came back. And I think Dad would have looked at the age and said, well, we're in a modern age now, even though for us that doesn't seem very modern, but it's very different to how it was. Medicine is very different and all those things. So I think if he did any risk assessment, it was, well, we're not that far from New Zealand. We're not that far, from whatever, even though it'll take a couple of days by boat, or whatever. That's not too bad. It's not in a jungle somewhere where, nobody can ever find us. So, I think it was God called them. They said, yes, let's get on with it.
Now, this book is just a selection of hundreds and hundreds of letters and documents and photographs that you or your father uncovered and you've been through yourself. Is there any likelihood that some more of them are going to be published?
This is a taster. We'll see what the interest is. I think we've said that we would be very interested in seeing whether we could share some more, maybe in a slightly different format, maybe printed slightly differently. But we've not said no. We'll wait and see.
Are there any amazing stories still to be shared then? Ones that perhaps didn't make it into the book? Because obviously you've had to select from a vast number of documents and letters.
I think the major issues have been covered in this volume. I think what hasn't been is the very everyday. And I'm not sure who would be interested in the very everyday. What we've got are the first 3 years of their lives. However, Dad has a wealth of knowledge, and I am hopeful that we can persuade him to share. And he has so many more stories to tell that are not documented in letters, but we've got a lot of photos from the next 3 years as well. And it's the photos and the slides which actually would be fascinating in another publication. And Dad could tell a good few stories about those slides. So I think there's more to share, but and some fascinating insights, particularly about buildings and things like that. We've got lots of photos about buildings, and I think Dad could share quite a bit about that.
I started by saying the Cook Islands that they went to is very different from today, and you have some of your own reflections on how the islands have changed over those years. What for you is the most significant change, and what are your thoughts on the future?
The world has got smaller. It has been easier to get to the islands, particularly the southern group. Tourism has grown. The interest in the islands has grown. There are a lot of tourists. There are a lot of people looking at how they can develop the infrastructure. All of that has to be balanced with maintaining and caring for the land. And it's a fine balance, which I think the islands wrestle with. And so when I first went there, there was less tourism. There were less people around. Nowadays, I can come back to England and find people who've been to Aitutaki. Whereas, when I first went out there, nobody had heard of Aitutaki. So, things have changed, and we are concerned. I think we have to be concerned about climate change. We have to be concerned that the islands can remain fully independent, or as independent as possible, with the unions that they have and the support that they have from their partners. But they have to be able to maintain their own identity, and their land, which is so important to them, is kept for future generations. And so the change for me, the biggest change, is tourism and infrastructure, and trying to balance the pressures of developing income and developing structures, but maintaining the land for the next generation.
So here we are, nearly 70 years on from when your parents moved to the islands. What do you think your family's story has to say to a 21st century reader?
I think step out, be bold. Go for it. I mean, they went for it. They took some risks, and you don't know what history you're creating. And I think there's a sense that, my parents, when they went out, they had no idea the legacy they were leaving. They had no idea the impact. They had no idea that there are still people on the islands that remember them all these years later, 70 years later. There are people there who still remember them fondly for what they did. So I think one of the messages I would share is, we don't know the legacy we're leaving, but it's actually, we've got opportunities to do things, say things, write down accounts, however we record them these days, for the next generation, because the next generation might find it really interesting. Dad says, who'd be interested in my book? Who'd be interested in all those letters? Well, everybody I've shown the book to or talks about are interested, but Dad had no idea. And I think the message for today is you've got no idea what the next generation, how they will benefit from what we do now.
Simeon Sturney. His book, Legacy: A Missionary's Life, Letters from the Cook Islands, is out now, and there are details about how to get a copy in the notes accompanying this podcast. Simeon, thank you very much. Mitaki Atupaka, as I think they say in Aitutaki.
They do, yes, Mitaki Atupaka, John. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Join me again soon for more unique insights into the Cook Islands through the eyes of those who know them best. I'm John Roberts, and that's CookieCast. Thank you for listening.